Everyone, welcome back to the channel, and as promised, me and my dad are today doing a podcast, and I'm just going to ask my dad some questions about HIV and how he felt when I first told him I was diagnosed with HIV. So the first question I'd like to ask me dad is, what was your knowledge of HIV before my diagnosis? What was your understanding of it?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, my understanding was very limited. When HIV first hit the news headlines, I think one of the first celebrities who came down with HIV was Rock Hudson, and I remember thinking how shocked I was, not so much over the HIV diagnosis, but I guess also the fact that Rock was gay. That wasn't general knowledge at that time. I think largely ignorant, really. I think in those days we thought that if you got HIV, that was it. It was a death sentence. You were naturally going to get AIDS. I mean, even later, in the late 80s, early 90s, when Freddie Mercury was diagnosed, and then sadly that led to his demise as well. I think most people would assume that once you got an HIV diagnosis, that was it.
I think in them days it was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was a death sentence.
And then more recently, I guess, although one was aware, you didn't really have a reason, I suppose, to keep abreast of what was happening in the HIV world. Although I was aware of drugs like the I think they call it PrEP, is it PrEP?
Yep.
And I was aware of that. I don't think I was aware of how advanced treatment of HIV had become. So I guess the honest answer is largely ignorant, really. I think it's like a lot of things that unless it actually hits your household in some way, you tend to be largely ignorant of things. You don't really know much about it, and or not as much as perhaps you could know.
And what's your feeling on how people were treated back then when HIV first hit the scene in the early 80s? What's your...
Yeah, it was awful, really. I mean, it wasn't until I think Tom Hanks brought that film out, Philadelphia. And I think before that, I would have to admit, even having a slight prejudiced feelings myself, back then. You put it all down to lifestyle, either drugs or sex lifestyle, and it could be very, very easy to think in negative ways towards anyone who was unfortunate to have had a diagnosis back then. I think if we're honest, if we all ask ourselves honestly, I think there's a bit of that in all of us. But I have to say, towards probably into the 90s, my feelings began to change. I began to see how, particularly when Princess Diana, in actual fact, started doing her work, and before her, even Princess Margaret and others who seemed to have so much compassion and care for people who were diagnosed and who were struggling with this virus. And I think they did a lot to, change people's views towards those suffering.
Well, it was that famous scene with Diana when she was in the hospital and she shook the hands of that gentleman who had HIV. I think he had actually full-blown AIDS at the time.
I think he did, yeah.
That simple act broke down, or at least started breaking down, stigma. And I would say she was probably one of the first, if not the first, to really start tackling stigma, that is associated with people that are living with HIV.
Yeah.
And when you went to Africa, all them years ago, you must have been going, how long was it you went back and forth from Africa?
I started in 1993. I used to visit Tanzania, and I went for a couple of months in 1993, and that was before mobile technology or anything like that, and things were still pretty gruesome, really, and there was clearly evidences of many people struggling and dying
from HIV. Yeah, back in them days it was still a death sentence. And I think for some it still is. In certain countries they don't have access to medication, and still today in 2024 there's still places you can't get access to it.
I remember one occasion I was asked to go and pray for a man who had full-blown AIDS and I walked into his hut because he was living in this little more than a mud hut really, with roofing on it, and he was just lying on his bed and he was skeletal. And the first thought that came to my mind is, this man looks like he's going to die. And they'd asked me to go in and pray for him to be healed. And I really struggled to find any faith at all that this guy's diagnosis was going to be reversed. And I prayed for him. And then literally within about 10 minutes, 5 African pastors came and asked me what I did, and I told them. And they went in and prayed for him and came out and they said, he's gone. And I said, gone? And they said, yeah, we felt God wanted us to pray for him to go home. And so he's gone home. And it was an eye-opener for me, really, that I just went in there assuming all sorts of things. And and I guess that really came home to me. I began to realise just how awful that virus, the damage it had done in Africa, and it is still doing in many parts of the world where they can't and haven't got access to these medications that are so incredible. It's an eye-opener.
Well, we both got to go to Africa in 2007 together with the church that you were still pastoring at the time. And we went to 2 orphanages that had children in that were all the kids in both orphanages had HIV, but I think the one that was run by the Catholic Church had quite nice facilities, and then one was run by the local people, which they basically had nothing. Yeah. And I remember that little girl who came out, she must have been no more than 3 years old. She stood right in front of me, had a t-shirt on just filled with holes. It was just rags really. And she stood in front of me and just wet herself. And she obviously didn't have a nappy on. And I had to go back to the coach that we were on, and I just bawled my eyes out because I just, it really broke my heart seeing that child who probably isn't here now, has probably passed away, had nothing. And it really affected me, and it stayed with me, and right the way up to today, and when I was diagnosed with HIV as well, it just,
And it was still a killer then, even back in the early 2000s, because they don't have access to the medications that we have in the West. Something you probably won't realise, in actual fact, 'cause I don't often talk about it, is on that particular trip, when we went to that orphanage, I was cuddling a little boy who'd got open sores on his head, and I'd actually, earlier that day, if you remember, we'd been doing some building work, and I'd got an open cut on my hand, and it didn't occur to me, do you know what I mean, the possible danger. And I was handling this boy with these weeping sores and whatever, and then I suddenly realised that I got this open cut, so I had to actually get tested when I returned, and I had to go back 2 or 3 times for 2 or 3 tests over the next few months. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness me, I should have been more careful. That's going back then, obviously. It's different now, but back then there was no kind of medication at all for them, and really all the orphanage could do was give them a home and give them some food, and that was about it.
So moving forward to October of 2021, and that day that I told you that I've received HIV diagnosis, but before that I remember it stuck in my head that obviously me and my wife, Mary Jane, went through a period of infidelity, and I remember you telling me you need to get tested, both of you, because you've both been with other people, and you need to get tested. And I was just, I think, fobbing you off, thinking there's no need, there's no signs of anything. And then that day I got an infection, and that is what drove me to go to the doctors, and then he referred me to a sexual health clinic, and I was being tested for something, not HIV, it was gonorrhea or chlamydia, I think. and the test came back as negative for that, but positive HIV, positive diagnosis. So what went through your head?
I remember
first told you them words, that they were
Yeah.
letters, HIV.
Well, the first thing was that was the last thing I think either your mum or I were expecting.
Yes.
You know, I was expecting you perhaps to tell me that you'd perhaps got a urinary tract infection.
That's what it actually turned out being, the infection.
Yeah, and I remember when you told us, you started off by saying something along the lines of, "Oh, I haven't got gonorrhea, and I haven't got syphilis, and chlamydia." But then you got round to saying, "But they found HIV," and it's hard really to describe or remember exactly the feelings. It's a little bit like going down a tunnel, you know what I mean, that you weren't expecting to go down, like on a roller coaster or something, and it was kind of, oh my goodness. And then you start thinking, you know, and what does this mean? You know, and because I hadn't kept informed, if you like, over the advances that have been made, I knew that there were medications and things like that.
Did you still think it was a death sentence, or?
I don't think I thought that it was a death sentence, although...
Did you think my life would be shorter than what it might have
certainly thought that, and I thought that there would be other, you know, side effects and whatever, either with the drugs, you know, because the antiretroviral drugs that they used to have, there used to be a lot of side effects, and they used to have to take loads and loads of pills.
Throughout the day, they have to take multiple pills, multiple
you know,
times.
So I thought it was going to be something like that to begin with. And then, of course, because you've got 5 children as well, and there's all those thoughts go through your mind. Does this mean we're going to need to step up as grandparents and, you know, even look eventually at having to take on the kids? And there's all that sort of go flash. But the main thing I remember, in terms of my actual personal response to it, was I had flash in my mind a photograph that I've still got on my phone of you when you was about 2 years old, and you're sat on the step of your grandparents, and you've got a ice cream lolly, and you're sat between your mum and I, and I had this image just go in my mind, and almost...
I was actually looking up at you, wasn't I? In the picture?
Gazing up at me, and it's one of my favourite photographs of you, and although it's a bit blurry now because of age and whatever, because you're old now, you know, I remember thinking, he's still my boy. Whatever happens and whatever has happened, he's still my boy. And yeah, you know, you said earlier about, you know, you had already spoken to Mum and I about, you know, the lifestyle you'd both been living, and you know, and all those sorts of things, and we didn't struggle in kind of remembering the more important things. You know, that the more important things are, you're our child, always have been, always will be. We've all made mistakes in life, we've all made silly decisions, myself included. But you know, I had this image, strong image going to my mind, and I'm thinking, he's still my boy, whatever. You know, and nothing will change that. And it's like any kind of crippling illness that anyone can get. I think that it tests where you're really at with someone. You know, when you get the worst of news, you kind of think, well, what do I think now? What do I feel now? Well, what I felt then and now is you're still my boy, and that's it. And I know that there's a lot of stigma and there is a lot of negativity around the whole thing, and people want to point the finger. And that's all very well, and that's all very comforting when it's not your own child.
For me, I don't think, through living with HIV now for 3 years and researching it, you know what I'm like when I start researching things. I have to know everything about it, or as much as possible. It's seeing how people are treated all around the world, in the West as well, and it's just I don't think I've come across any illness that is stigmatized like HIV. You know, and it's why do you think that is? Why do you think that is?
I think that the reasons for your response particularly is that's how you've always been. ever since you were a little boy, you've always advocated for those who you felt were being picked on or bullied. You know, I remember you getting into trouble a few times at school and getting beaten up and all sorts of things because you stuck up for someone. So when you began to research and when you began to look into it, and then you began to speak even to your mum and myself quite authoritatively on it, that did not surprise me, because that's the kind of man you've become. And you were that way even as a little boy. You know, you would stick up for people, you would befriend people who you saw were weaker, or who had some kind of something with them that caused them to be picked on and bullied, you know, and some sort of characteristic, that's the word I was looking for. And so you were always that way. So when you began to start looking into HIV and started to research on it, you know, then that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was the kind of response that you got once you hit social media. And at the time, Mum and I and other members of the family were concerned more for yourself as to what will this mean if Pete goes on social media and all of a sudden everything now is out there. And how will this impact him, his family, because once they're up there, once those videos are out there, there's no taking them down. You know, it's in people's minds. And what will it mean for us? And in actual fact, I think some of the responses you were getting shocked us, really. We thought there'd be a lot more negativity than there was. And I know you've had one or two people who've wanted to make a point or, you know, whatever, but...
Yeah, you're always going to get haters.
Yeah.
And at first it used to really annoy me, but I've learned just to ignore them, you know.
But I think that largely people's response has been positive, yeah, and looking and actually encouraging you for what you're doing and how brave you are. Because I think in the back of people's minds very often is, I'm not sure I could be so open about my life and about the things I've done that are perhaps not what's the word I'm looking for, then they're not the sort of things I'd like to be out in the open there. You know, I think everyone's...
And I can understand why, you know, for me to get to this point took nearly 3 years, you know, and it what made me want to start speaking out about it was seeing how people were being treated.
Yeah.
You know, I just couldn't sit in silence and say nothing and do nothing. I felt, you know, something in me wanted me to speak out about it, and that's what pushed me to do what I'm doing.
And I mean, it's the marvellous thing about your own story, Pete, is not just the HIV. I mean, you were 25 plus years in addiction.
Yeah.
And all of this stuff came to a head all at the same time. And I remember...
July of 2021, so it was actually 2 or 3 months before I even knew I had HIV.
That's right.
Is when the change actually started.
I remember you, someone saying to you about how thin you were and how gaunt, and I won't say who that is for obvious reasons, but you know, this person had said to you, "Oh, Pete, you look really gaunt," and that almost like hit you like a ton of bricks. And
it really got me angry actually. But then I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to show you. And that's when I started training. And this is before I knew I had HIV. I was losing weight very rapidly, feeling very ill, getting all sorts of symptoms, and I started training at home and then progressed to the gym. But that's when the change started.
I remember that, you know. And then once you started at the gym, by that time obviously you know, it was fairly soon after that you got your diagnosis and everything else. You knew what you were fighting.
Well, yeah, me and MJ were going through it all came out. We were both being unfaithful. We've both been sort of drifting apart over a 3-year period, and it all came out into the open. I won't say how, but it all came out in the open, that we were both cheating, and that brought us to a point where we could have either gone 2 ways, down the road of divorce or fight for our marriage. And HIV obviously came along 2 months after that, the diagnosis, but that's when the change started. It was before we even knew we had HIV, and HIV definitely played a part in the change. But you know, what we have now is just amazing, as you know. You've witnessed to it, you and Mum.
The life change is just incredible, and there's all sorts of things that contribute into that. You know, your gym experience, obviously, and faith. You know, the fact that you're up there every day almost as well. You know, that you've kept to it and you keep to it, and how there are guys up there who are on steroids and all sorts of things who find it hard to believe that you've done all this naturally, which of course we know you have. That you don't take steroids, you don't even take powders or anything like that. That it's diet, exercise, positive attitude, and your faith,
consistency,
and everything.
Consistency with my faith, consistency with training, and there's no secret remedy.
I mean, I think the great thing for me,
I think I had to as well hit rock bottom, and I hit rock bottom in July of 2021. I couldn't go any lower than what I went. And there was a multitude of things going on, obviously, as what you know. I was struggling with sexuality, I was struggling with addiction, full of guilt and shame, and I just couldn't cope with it anymore. And then just when me and MJ found out that we were both cheating, it just brought us to that point to share. I felt that's what happened. We were brought to a point where, you know, the only option, there's two options, either divorce or change and something better. And what came out of that was something better. And I just poured out my heart to MJ, told her everything that had been going on in my head for almost 36 years up until that point. And where we are now is just, I can't describe in words. We're closer than we've ever been. Our relationship is better than it's ever been. Physically, I'm better than I've ever been. Spiritually, I'm better than I've ever been. And HIV has played a part. It's not been the catalyst for the change, but it's certainly played a part. So out of all of that horror, what I was feeling at the time, has come life.
Yeah, and I think as you know, I started getting involved in addiction back in 2018, and I was working at a centre full time for just over 4 years, all the way through COVID. And that was the key with everybody, was, has this person reached rock bottom yet? And obviously for them, for people in rehab, you are creating a program and a process that they have to go through. You've done that yourself. You created your program, i.e. the gym and your faith and everything else, but then that allowed a deeper process to begin to take place. And then when you began to talk to us about the issues that had caused such anger and devastation in your life, and that was difficult for us as well as parents, listening to it, but knowing that for many, many years we'd wanted you to speak to us, but you just couldn't at the time. Your pain and your words was coming out through your addictions. And as hard as we tried to get you to talk, you just weren't ready for that. But then when you hit rock bottom, something changed, and then you started to pour out everything that had happened. And that was hard listening as parents as well sometimes, particularly, you know, towards people who were involved in creating the pain in your life. I think that was probably harder to deal with than your diagnosis in many ways, because there's a part in a father just wants to go and find that person and have it out with them. But of course, I had to hold back because this is your story and you deal with it in the way that you deal with it. And so there was all of that as well. But I think fundamentally for me, what it came down to was this: you're our boy, always have been, always will be.
Yep.
And nothing's changed that. And, you know, not HIV, not addiction, nothing. You know, I think every parent's heart, hopefully, would long for their child to be found again and to come home. You know.
Did you have any idea, this is always something I've wanted to ask you actually, did you have any idea that I was struggling with sexuality?
I think you dropped hints now and again, you know, over the years. You certainly dropped hints that something had happened. We just didn't know to what depth that had happened or affected you. I don't think we were probably aware of how much you'd struggled with your sexuality, because we never talked about that until now. So yeah, I guess we were aware something was going on. We were aware something had happened, but it was all still a mystery, really, until you were ready to talk, and that's the key. I don't think a person can be expected to disclose that sort of stuff unless they're 120% certain of the love that people still have towards them. And I think that's why a lot of people are still trapped. You know, they're afraid to speak out in case what that may mean. Will that mean I'll lose my family? Will I lose everybody? I mean, that's hard for anybody to face that.
It's the way society views them as well.
Yeah.
And I think this is why a lot of people struggle to come out about their sexuality and what they're struggling with, you know, and what's hidden inside, you know, like for myself.
Yeah.
You know, I was scared of people's reactions, fearful what people would think, and it's a horrible place to be.
Yeah.
But now, being open about everything that's happened and what's been going on in my own head, and just being able to speak about these things has lifted such a weight off my shoulders. And I think you can see that with the way I am now as a person.
Definitely.
The way I'm living now, I'm totally different.
Yeah.
You know, there's parts of me that are still the same, but you know, I think overall I'm a completely different person.
Well,
to
I think
I was
3
years ago.
The essential you is still there.
Yeah.
The essential Pete that we've all known and loved is still there, untarnished and unaffected. It's the stuff that happens in life very often that seeks to define us, but you've now battled in such a way as to make sure it doesn't define you any longer. You know, and that's the great thing, I think, for your mum and I, is watching you as you grow through this and as you go through this. And obviously it's phenomenal how your social media platforms have taken off. You know, TikTok, I think you're approaching 30,000 followers now. Your YouTube channel has exploded, your Instagram channel has exploded, and people reaching out to you, you know, needing support and encouragement and inspiration and motivation, all those sorts of things. It's an incredible privilege.
I think for me as well, it's you know, when I saw how before I came out about my diagnosis, when I saw how people were being treated around the world and how people living with HIV are viewed as weak and sickly, and you know, on concoctions of medication, I think I just wanted to show through social media and through my training what someone who's living with HIV is capable of.
Yeah.
You know, and the reality is, there's lots of myths about HIV, but the reality is you can live a normal, long, happy life living with HIV.
Yeah.
It doesn't restrict you physically, but what does restrict people now is the stigma.
Yeah.
It's not the virus that's deadly, it's the stigma that is killing people now. Obviously there are still people dying from HIV, but that's down to them not being able to get access to medication, from what I've found through my own research. But it's the stigma, that is what is deadly. You know, and I receive stigma every day online. You know, as my channels grow, the more of it I'm getting. 99.9% of what I receive over social media is encouragement and love, which is amazing, and I'm so grateful for it. But there is still a lot of hate out there, a lot of ignorance. And I think, like in my younger years, when I was faced with bullies, I go at them head on. Even, you know, I've got beaten up many times, like you said, but I just can't sit. I hate seeing bullying. I just can't. There's something, it stirs something in me, and that is now carried on into my adult life and what I'm doing now. I've got such a heart for people that are living with HIV and who are struggling with sexuality. Because it's just, it shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't be happening.
Well, it's the same with drug addiction and all sorts of addictions as well. And I mean, you're seeing that now. You come with me to the centre that I'm currently working at, and you've become a popular visitor there, and the lads really connect to you, not only because of your HIV diagnosis, but because you're coming from a 25-year plus addiction history, you know, and you've shown that you can come out of this, you can overcome this, you can change. You've just got to really, really want it, you know.
Absolutely,
and it's fantastic to see that.
That's the key. You've got to want. You've got to want.
And who'd have thought that you and I would be on the road together? And
no, I mean, this is another part of the positivity. Excuse the pun, but that's come out of my diagnosis and this change. But yeah, what are your views now of HIV? Your knowledge. What has changed from when I told you about my diagnosis to now? What have you learned?
Certainly the big thing would be no more fear.
Mm-hmm.
Fear has definitely been put on the back burner, especially when, I think, even as you told me over the phone, you told me what the nurse had said to you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that don't worry, you know, there's so much we can do now. This is
easily treatable.
The end of your life. It's treatable and all that.
One pill a day.
Yeah. One pill, and also how, you know, when you are, what's the U equals U? Undetectable equals untransmissible, and all those types of things as well are actually really good positive things, because there's less, there should be less stigma over it, because you know, I take more. We usually joke about this, don't you? I take more pills than you do.
Yeah.
You know, I take a pill for high blood pressure. I take pills for type 2 diabetes. I take statins. You know what I mean? So I'm on more drugs than you are, and yet there's far less stigma associated with age-related conditions very often, or conditions that you can get from living the wrong lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know, and so as far as about that. So yeah, my whole attitude towards it has changed greatly. I think the more educated I've become watching your social medias, but also, you know, hooking in on other things now that are out there and getting to know more about it. The more you get to know about it, the less frightening it then is. And also, you become aware of what people are going through. Not just the whole physical side of things, but what they're going through in terms of stigma, bullying, all those types of things, and opinions that people have. I think you put it this way, Pete, you know, people go through this stigma for having sex.
Yeah.
And there's
all they're guilty of, and I don't think they're guilty of anything, but it's having sex. It's a normal human function.
Yeah.
But for some reason, it's wrapped up in all this stigma.
Yeah.
And I still can't fully understand why to this day that HIV carries so much baggage. You know, HIV has moved on, but unfortunately the stigma is still stuck in the past. And I think there's something Gareth Thomas once said in a podcast I was listening to that, if I can remember it, it's very easy to educate people, but it's very hard to uneducate people.
Yeah, it's very good.
Which I thought was an amazing quote.
Yeah, because when you look into history, there's been other STDs such as syphilis. That was a killer.
Yeah.
They had special cemeteries in which they would bury people who died of what was known then as the pox, you know, or syphilis. And even up to fairly recently, you know, if you caught syphilis, then that was possibly either a killer or certainly would leave you with all sorts of other health conditions, and so that carried with it, I'm sure, as well, a lot of stigma. But over the time, it's become less of a stigma because it's more easily treatable now.
Well, I think there's a lot of people out there that used to think, or may still think, it only affects gay men.
Yeah.
But the reality is HIV has no boundaries.
Yeah.
You know, if you're having sex, then you're as vulnerable as anyone else.
Of course.
You know, you know, and that's reality. HIV can affect anyone.
Yeah.
It's not a gay disease. You know, it just affected the gay community first, I think. But that's not. It's not the thing anymore.
Yeah. There were the two communities, really, wasn't there? If you caught HIV years ago, people would assume you're either homosexual or you're a drug addict, and you've shared needles or whatever, you know, and people's thoughts then could be really, really horrible, really. It was almost like, oh, well, you deserve it. You know, I know you've had that put on your,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
comments and that. And it's,
People are very quick to judge,
yeah,
is what I'm finding.
yeah.
But yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
That's been good.
All right, guys. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. As always, please leave a comment and I'll try and get back to you as quickly as I can. Please like the video if you like it. Please subscribe and hit that notification bell and it will alert you to any future videos that I post. But I've enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's been good.
Hope you enjoy it as well, and we're going to do another one in the future as well on possibly a number of different subjects. If there's anything you'd like us both to discuss together, then please leave a comment and we'll try and do that. Hope you have a great day, guys, and take care.